teaching style, and certainly last week in trying to make connections, that sometimes you just don't have to do it. So today there are no connections. You can make your own. How about that, right? So chapter 14 of Luke. Not difficult, although there's a little bit of an opportunity for reflection, which I think we should do this morning. I'll read today. We're going to look at a continuation of Jesus' journey towards Jerusalem. But we have an interesting, I think, something of interest that should be discussed right from the onset. Okay, so chapter 14. One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. And he said to them, Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out? And they could not reply to these things. Questions, observations. Before we get into the parable, I think we need to break apart something of interest in the opening section of chapter 14. Anybody?
Well, he had just gone through healing the woman, and they asked him, but he's asking them now.
Yeah, I found it of interest too.
And they're silent.
Yeah, I found this very interesting.
So they're not quick to answer.
Right. In fact, this is the fourth time Luke makes a point of telling us about healing on the Sabbath. The fourth time. He does it before in 6, 1 through 5, 6, 11, 13, 10 through 17, and now here. So clearly, there is some, not healing on Sabbath, Sabbath. There's clearly an issue between the Pharisees, because he names the Pharisees, and Jesus when it comes to the Sabbath. And I'm not sure that I've reflected properly as to why. But it's clearly, Luke, for him to mention it 4 times, means that this was not the only time. There was more than 4. And B, I think there's an importance to this. I just don't know if I've got it. Go ahead.
Well, I don't know where he says the Sabbath was made for man not for the Sabbath. Meaning that this really is a gift. This is supposed to be a gift to you, and you made it into some sort of bondage law thing. And truly, what amazing gift to give on the Sabbath is healing. I mean, he's healing these people. He's not just giving them rest, he's restoring them. And I don't know, they just completely lost what the Sabbath is supposed to be.
Yeah, and there's no Old Testament, there's no law, there's no distinctive law in Old Testament Mosaic law that says you can't heal. And I looked at some language here. Some of you may have got donkey and ox in your translations. The actual word donkey and son are so similar, bizarrely, in Greek that some of original manuscripts mistranslated it. I actually think the thing's the same. I think there's something to the donkey and the son being. So I want us to. I mean, the Sabbath was an issue. You've got 7 things in here. One, okay. You've got the ruler of the Pharisees, right? So clearly, this chap, the house who he's at, is not just a Pharisee. He is the highest authority, or one of the highest authorities of the Pharisees, right?
Here was something I was wondering about this. What are they doing having a party on the Sabbath? This is a social event, obviously.
Yeah, no, don't misunderstand that. That's a big deal for the meal after the synagogue is a big deal for Jews. So they have their traditional celebration meal at dusk on Friday, which is, I can't remember what they call it, it'll come to me. That's a very distinctive meal, and that's family, that's only family. You may invite people to it, but it's much more intimate. The meal after the synagogue, after celebration, is very similar to us in terms of Sunday lunch. Actually, I think that tradition carried on for quite some time throughout history from those early European churches. They would have celebrated together on Sunday following the Jewish tradition. To say it's a party might be a bit of a stretch, but clearly this is a big deal because we get that from the parables he now tells us, right? I agree with that. What is of importance is that it's the guy. Why is the guy with dropsy there? As such a high-profile leader of the Pharisees. A, he's either related to the host, or B, it's a test on Jesus. And I would suggest, my interpretation is that it's a test because this is the fourth time Luke mentions, and the second time he mentions healing. So I think it's a test. Dropsy is not life-threatening. It just happens to be an annoyance, right? It's those of you in the medical profession, it's an accumulation of fluid in the body. So it's not life-threatening, so they would have used this distinctly in a different way. He also sends the man away, which I think is intriguing, as if to say, I've dealt with him, now I want to get back to you. And he said to them, which of you? So the fact that they don't say anything, I think is key. They remain silent. Why do they remain silent? In fact, they remain silent twice. So one interpreter that I read earlier on this week argues that the issue of not healing on the Sabbath, or certainly taking an ox out of a well, was late rabbinic teaching that we know from the people at Qumran, which is where the Dead Sea Scrolls came from. They inserted it there. It wasn't in the original manuscripts. So they inserted, the rabbinic teaching inserted this idea that you couldn't heal on the Sabbath, which made me reflect on the Sabbath even more. I wonder, once again, Vinceism, don't tell a pastor, I wonder if the Sabbath issue is one of show. Because they all were not working, it was a real highlight to show your orthodoxy on what you wouldn't do on a Sabbath versus what you would do on a Sabbath. Very similar to sometimes how we feel about going to church. And as I was driving along today, looking at people walking in the beautiful briskness, and exercising, and thinking to myself, they should be in church, right? And I thought to myself, maybe there's a connection there. That the Sabbath issue is one of outward show, which was a big deal for the Pharisees and the scribes, because Jesus mentions it many times, versus inward law, that effectively you can keep many of the laws in Deuteronomy that no one would ever see. Laws on the Sabbath are very, very observant to others. That's just my view. You can take it another way.
There's just nothing fun about it. I mean, if I had a button on a shirt that fell off, I would not want to not do anything about it. So it just seems very constricting and not restful and not what the Sabbath was meant to be.
Yeah.
Everything that they've created it to be, I mean, inactivity, totally doing nothing is not fun. It's not, it's just a big bore. I mean, and it can make your mind go crazy. And so I don't know. I mean, it's bizarre what they made it, but it just seems very, very legalistic.
And legalistic I think is the issue. And it became such a big deal between Jesus and them.
It's all bondage. Right.
And Jesus is clearly invited to this person's house. It's a leading person. He's invited. He's there as a preacher, respected, want to find out. Their job is to control the law theologically. All right, let's continue. The parable of the wedding feast. And this will help actually some of our questions. Verse 7. Now he told a parable to those who were invited. When he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, when you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, give your place to this person. And then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. And when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, friend, move up higher. Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. All right, questions, observations. Odd parable, I think. Odd parable. Questions, observations. Yes, Oliver?
It's saying that don't put yourself as high as you can
That's very good. You're right. It is don't put yourself higher than you think. In fact, if you start low, you would then move up in the highest. So a parable points to the kingdom, right? So this end time feast is a big deal throughout all of Scripture. Jesus mentions it many times, many times. So this feast issue is both literal because they're at a feast, a dinner, and also symbolic because the Jews were all about, at one point, from Isaiah 46, at one point, they're going to be at this eschatological, this end-time feast with God, right? We get that in a little while. Jeremy?
In the end, you kind of get, you be placed where you deserve anyways. Doesn't matter. You should choose your lower setting because in the rightful position in an ideal circumstance will come to you anyhow.
Yeah.
Whether you choose it correctly and you get lowered because you thought more of yourself, or if you humbly choose think less of yourself, you'll still end up in the right spot.
So Jesus is actually, he's actually using Proverbs 25, 6 and 7. Do not put yourself forward in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great. For it is better to be told, come up here, than to be put lower in the presence of a noble. It wasn't unusual in this culture, or actually it continued for 1,000 years. It wasn't unusual for a more important person to arrive late, and you would be moved for them to sit at a place higher on the table. This was not unusual. Seems odd to us today, right? But it's not unusual. He does continue this with the issue of the Great Banquet in a minute. But I like that if you look at it, we shouldn't go to a place where Jesus is going to present somebody higher. It's actually the issue of your mindset at the table that's key. That do not think higher of yourself, I think is what Jesus is saying.
Than of someone else.
Yeah, than of somebody else. That if you take a position of humbleness first, Jesus' ministry was all about that. If you take a position of humbleness first, you're more likely to be exalted in being told to move up higher, rather than a position of height and then being surpassed by somebody else. That's difficult theology, if I'm honest, in terms of God's dealing with us, if you look at the kingdom. But I think it's about mindset. Jesus accepts the humble in society, the poor, the downtrodden. He said, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the kingdom of heaven. And here you have a kind of a view of that, right? The meekness and humbleness of how we're supposed to approach our relationship with Jesus. If you take the same thing as he's talking to the Pharisees, which he says to them clearly, he potentially is saying that they are the ones who set themselves as the highest, who will be moved.
Jesus really set the example for this also throughout his whole life. I mean, how he was born, how he came to the world, how he lived, how he died.
Yeah.
Humility is a theme all throughout the New Testament, especially.
And still is today, and it should be still today. And I do think that it has practical applicable warning to us all about how we approach our Christian walk. We are meant to do so with humility, which can be difficult. I find it difficult. I'll be honest with you. I find doing anything with humility difficult. So I do sense. What are you laughing at? I do sense that I'm talking to Oliver, by the way. I do sense that there is a little bit of an applicable nature here in terms of just who we are as Christians. Paul says it a lot. Paul continues to say it a lot. Sorry?
It's tough having a servant heart
Yes.
these days in a culture that promotes me.
I mean, that's awesome, because actually, you think about it, even our culture today, it's definitely all about this. That you don't rise up the ranks unless you put yourself forward. That someone gets to see you. How does somebody at the top get to see somebody who's being humble at the bottom, right? That's a big deal in our society today. In anything, actually. I remember being told once when I first started my career, you can make a career on a good presentation, and you could kill a career on a bad one, right? It's that thing where how you're noticed is key. So there's a little bit of humbleness that we have to bring into our applicable nature. All right, let's get to the big parable of this particular chapter, the Great Banquet. Once again, you've got to link this up, this Jewish scripture, not Jewish, I'm sorry, please forgive me. This very strong scripture that goes through both Old Testament and New Testament on the banquet feast, the final banquet feast, the feast with God himself, right? That is pretty clear. But it's who is at the feast that you have to understand in the parable. He said to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers, or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. When you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. You will be repaid at the resurrection of the just." Okay, questions, observations?
There he's very much saying, don't give show to yourself. Give show to the show that you're caring more for the lame and the sick, who can't do anything for themselves.
Yes, but it's not literal as invite them to dinner. That's not what this parable is saying. So what is it saying?
Do for others that can't do for you.
Yeah, I think so. I think the key to this particular section is, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid.
Isn't it more about being that way rather than doing a task?
Yeah,
living your life that way, and the way that you go about who you are and how you present yourself, rather than, you said, literally inviting someone to dinner.
Once again, please just get my view. I'm not saying I'm right or wrong here, or it's right or wrong here. I think there's because you've got this idea of Luke says repay 3 times.
Yeah.
He says, you be repaid, you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, and you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. That's a kind of a big deal, I think. Please, my view, right? In this particular piece of the parable, it's about the repayment. That
About knowing where your treasure is, storing up treasure.
right. So I'm not sure that it's a literal point of banquet. I think he's using the banquet analogy again. And we've got to go back to 13, where we talked about the banquet. And if you remember in 13, he talked about the banquet being that Abraham will sit with the birds, right? The Gentiles. That you will see Abraham, Moses, Isaac, Jacob sitting with the Gentiles. And I'm telling you my view. I think that's a continuation of that particular piece of analogy. That this big eschatological banquet's a big deal, which it is. So this one comes back to why we do stuff at the banquet table, the repayment in our hearts. What we tend to do is we tend to do things in order that we gain something back. So if this is a parable if
You're not giving, not so much repayment, but show.
right,
For them, rather than yourself.
how many times do we do things
Yeah.
because we're already foretelling what we expect, right?
Yeah, you're looking to give show and exaltation to the people who can't do anything.
Yeah, we tend to see X as a distinct relation to Y. So, and you can put whatever you want here, right? You can put whatever you want in X here. You can put, because we expect, that's the repay. And we tend to do based upon the repay.
He's just telling them to check their motive. What's your motive for doing it?
Yes.
It's so ingrained in us to want something back. And it's one of those things where it's just hard to really pour yourself out and really get nothing in return. And you are doing it for God and God alone. And that is a very difficult thing. It just is. It's addressing that. It's addressing the fact that you, and the whole thing with the nation of Israel, it was really supposed to bless the world with what it knew about God and its relationship. It was supposed to be kind of the standard bearer in a way. And I don't know. Yeah.
So I completely agree. I'm quite happy with it's just check your heart, right? Okay, if it's just check your heart, what does he mean by you repay the resurrection of the just? Because he didn't just throw that away. He ends the parable with a very distinctive view. The resurrection of the just is when And if you're going to say the resurrection of the just, you also have to say the resurrection of the damned. Right, absolutely. I don't know how you cannot just, for you to pray the resurrection of the just is a key piece here. Okay? So there's going to be a judgment between those who are unjust and those who are just. Checking your heart versus unjust and just, I think is a deeper meaning in the parable. Yes, sir.
I don't know if I'm right in saying this, but if you look at this as a transactional activity, invite people to your banquet, you get invited to their banquet. Invite some people to a banquet, they don't even have a banquet. Maybe the issue is you're approaching the banquet incorrectly. Maybe it's not who you invite, maybe it's what is the banquet, right? So the banquet here, as you talked about, if the parable points to the kingdom, he's telling those, your idea of a banquet is off. The banquet is not a transaction, you do this, you get repaid by those you've invited. You're looking at the banquet incorrectly. The banquet's already been hosted. Everything's already been set. Your single decision to the big banquet, tying back to the just, or those who have accepted Christ, the damned. Their notion of the banquet and how the banquet is transacted by who attends it is absolutely false.
So, I agree with you wholeheartedly. I actually think there's a little bit of a covenantal message in this with those who expect to be at the banquet. Right?
Yes.
And this is this issue of the just. There's those who are going to expect to be at the banquet. You don't get to look through the door and see who's at the banquet. At some point you're going to be told you're not invited.
Doesn't matter who you invite.
Right.
Because
So I agree. Let's continue. Let's pull this together with the rest of the parable. Because the parable is intersected by a question. A big question that would have existed in Jesus' day. When one of those who reclined at table with him heard these things, he said to him, "Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." Right? That's this big end of times banquet. But he said to him, "A man once gave a great banquet and invited many." Remember, the next parable is triggered by the question, "Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." Keep that in mind. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, "Come, for everything is now ready." But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, "I have bought a field, and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused." And another said, "I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to examine them. Please have me excused." And another said, "I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, And another said, "I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come." So the servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house became angry and said to his servant, "Go out quickly to the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame." And the servant said, "Sir, what you commanded has been done, and still there is room." And the master said to the servant, "Go out to the highways and hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste my banquet." Questions, observations?
I see a connection between the just and the unjust in the end times. Those who accept what Christ has offered and those who rejected it, for whatever their reasons were.
Yes. Right, so take a couple of things here. Number one, it's not unusual for them to have sent their servant to remind them. They would have sent out an invitation to say that there's a banquet. They then would have sent somebody out to tell them that everything has been done. We are now ready for the banquet, right? That was the culture of the day. You sent a slave to let everybody know. What you have is you have all of the invited, right? All of them have rejected. Yeah? You get that? The only one who has legal requirement under Deuteronomic law is the guy who's married his wife. He has a genuine legal excuse. It's in Deuteronomy 24:5. Right? The other two are not. So once again, Jesus gives us parables for us to look at for what it is. Clearly, Luke's reference to this parable, the master of the house is God the Father. Completely. The servant? Jesus. God the Son. Right, good. So, the invite, so now we need to figure out who's invited.
Well, he had, isn't Jesus referring here, I may be wrong about this, he had all these people that followed him around all the time. And some of it was just out of curiosity. And most of these people that followed him around were really not committed to him as true followers. And I think part of that is what he's saying. You know, you got people that are here and they're just, you know, they're just kind of along for the ride. I don't know. Maybe I've got this.
No, I don't think you have, and I don't want to skirt over this because just another parable, and we look at it simplistically and say, you know, there's a reason why he uses three. He uses that a lot, but there's a reason why the third one is in the law, right? 24:5 that a guy is allowed to. In fact, he can withdraw from any public authority. Can do not go to the army. He gets to spend a year with his wife, right? So he is legal. There's a legal requirement for it, but he's still thrown into the best.
Because the legalism doesn't trump. I mean, if we're saying that the servant's Jesus, that changed everything.
The legalism doesn't trump the invite, I think.
There.
I agree with that. I think the legalism doesn't give you to take away from the invite, because at the end of this parable, he says, none of these men, even the one who legally has the right to say, I can't come, will are invited shall taste my banquet, right? And you can really look into the deepness of the issue with the servant, the highways, the hedges. Yes, you can. I think he's basically saying that there are those who feel, if you continue Luke's thought process between Jesus is being invited by the leader of the Pharisees sitting at a Sabbath table, okay, and they're waiting, their theological policing, which is what they saw themselves as, their ability to police what was people doing under religious law, right or wrong, which is why they're testing him, then he's linking the parable back, hold on a second, Oliver, he's linking the parable back to the entire structure of 1338 in this idea of the banquet, and that potentially you're invited, which they are, but you will not come. For material gain, the first two, and adherence to the law of not changing the license. The legal piece comes in the next bit when he talks about hating your families, and we'll get to that in a minute. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
So I see a connection with this and when God flooded the earth, because it's kind of like saying that the host like made a banquet and he sent Jesus out and he sent his servant out to tell them it was ready, but none of them came. It's kind of like God created the world for all of the people, but Noah's family was the only ones that really worshipped God. So when the host says that none of them shall taste my banquet, it's kind of like God saying, I put them on this earth, I gave it to them so that they can worship me, and none of them have done it, I'm going to take it away from them.
That's really good. You're right, absolutely right. You know, God said, I'm sorry I ever created them, didn't he? He said, I'm sorry I ever created them. And and the link between that lovely piece in creation and then God deciding that there was only Noah and his family who were considered righteous, right, were allowed then on and creating the ark, I think is a really good link. Well done, young man. All right, so let's continue, because now you're going to look into what is a really tough piece of passage of scripture, which is 25 onwards. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, and even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king going out to encounter another king in war will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who come against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. Questions, observations?
Very simply put, you either accept all of him with all of who you are or nothing. You can't be sometimes a follower and sometimes not.
Yes.
That's a simplistic view, but.
Yes, no. I don't. There is simple. There is simplicity in everything, right? And something this man with no humility is having to learn. There is a simplicity to all of this. So the simplistic view must be Christ comes first. Christ comes first, right? And I believe that many people have misinterpreted this because renounce doesn't mean what we think renounce means. Be careful. And forgive me, Andrea.
Right, to the Jews, family was really, really important. And he didn't really mean you got to hate your family. It's just compared to how you look at me. They are so much less important than to be totally committed to God.
Good. I completely agree with that. So the Greek word for hate is apostasete, right? Which actually means give up. That's our best way. So if you say he does not give up his own father, and there are two ways of translating give up or apostasete. That is, when you look at people, it's to say goodbye. And when you look at things, it's to say I'm done with, right? But it's more temporal, it's more active as a verb than it is total. As in, to say goodbye but will come back is really what it means. And to say I'm done with now but come back is key. So, for example, if you take this verb as being you really have to give up everything, which a lot of people have done, then there's an hypocrisy because Peter goes back at the end in Luke. Peter, after Jesus' resurrection and unlost, goes back to Galilee to fish, right? Remember that? Well, if he'd done as Jesus said here, then there's hypocrisy because he would have shouldered his fishing boat and his hat, and he didn't. He goes back. Jeremy.
Does the word disciple here should not, am I asking a question? How are we phrase that? I don't think the word disciple here should be the same as believer.
Yes, I agree with that. So
asking
disciple
you to
shouldn't be the
step
same
above.
word as believer.
Well, I think he's asking for a step above. How can you count the cost if you don't know what you're doing? So
you like this from a practical application, that you think this is ministry people.
I struggle with this mightily to be a regular believer because if you're a believer, you can't know how to calculate the cost. You can't know the true enemy until you've been a believer. You simply can't do that. You can't ask someone who has no experience building a tower to calculate how to build a tower. You can't ask of those who don't have anything other but a mom and dad, but don't really understand the cost of saying goodbye to your mom and dad.
Same thing with war. Unless you've ever been a war or a soldier, you don't know what the cost of war is.
You can't calculate the cost if you're unable to calculate it.
Oh, this is really interesting. I had genuinely not read in this practical, that this is actually, and it would go back, potentially link this to the young man who says, what does it cost to follow me, right? The great ruler, which is in 18 that's coming up.
Yes.
So, is this that you're, but are we being very damning though of those who are just simple believers?
Great, that's the problem I'm having. Is this I would like to understand more about the true word disciple in this.
So you would like to know more about the true word disciple. You actually think what we've really got to do is figure out what he means by disciple rather than he means follower.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think there's a mistake that it's disciple or not. I might be wrong, but
No. That's important. I mean, so because once again, right? Luke does a lot of good work in his book. He tells us right at the beginning that he spent years doing research, talking to witnesses. This is not just a haphazard account, right? He says that. So either he's lying or you have to accept it. For him to turn around and say, now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them, means that he's actually making this address to those following. And there is a distinction between those who are following versus those who are really going to understand what it means to be his disciple. That's what you're saying, correct? I'm not trying to paraphrase what you're saying. That's the question you're asking. Is he making a distinction about those who potentially will go into ministry, if you look at it from a practical application, versus those who are believers? Okay. Does he ever say follower? Is anybody got in their text the word follower?
It's not there.
It's not in the ASB.
In ASB.
And it isn't the ESV, and they're very similar, the ESV and the NASB. So does anybody have the King James? You have the New King James. What does it say in the New King James? Disciple.
I'm not sure where we're at,
Sorry, we are, my apologies, 14:25.
Now great multitudes went with him, and he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and in his own life also, he cannot be my disciple.
Okay, so there you have it. I do, Jeremy, I have to agree with you, and agree with Andrea, that the Tower, the War, and Disciple are a big deal. Because you can't expect those who don't know what they're doing, right? So, having said that, in my own notes, I state here, my interpretation is that the commitment is up front. That the cost of Christian discipleship is not a theoretical ideal, it is reality, is what I put in my notes. Sorry? Yeah, right. So there is, but no, because that would mean, I agree with that, I like that. That would mean that could be a follower, the lose life to find the life, right? If this is more about the discipleship cost, you're looking at it.
He doesn't know what is being put up for the value of what's being done.
And maybe there's a little bit of you do not know what you're asking.
Well, even the use of disciples in the Great Commission, it's disciples, not believers, not followers. Go and make disciples. You know, so that there is a difference.
Yeah, follow me versus be my disciple. Disciples are sent without.
But when he
The
first
disciple-
called,
disciples are sent on their own with what they've been taught.
follow
Followers,
me and I'll make you fishers of men. So Jesus used both.
I don't know. I mean,
He-
I'm really beginning to think that a follower is a follower. A disciple is someone who disciples for. You are a disciple of. You are being sent. I want to use this carefully. A disciple is being sent in his stead, right? In his place a little bit, is doing work on his behalf. They're very different. A follower and a disciple.
And if you go back to the tower, and you talk about laying the foundation, I mean, the disciples were
Capable of it.
laying
Followers
that
aren't.
foundation.
And the war thing as well, I like that. The foundation is key, because he says you'll be mocked because you don't finish it. As in, this commitment that you make is one that you must make at the beginning, because it is not something you can just leave halfway through. I think.
Moment
Go ahead.
of sharing why I might be approaching it slightly different. I struggle with, was I right in becoming a deacon at Calvary?
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Let me repeat so that you can't be hit. So your personal application is that you really struggled with the idea of being, when they asked you to be a deacon, you struggled with the idea of being a deacon.
Right. Was it correct?
Okay.
And so maybe I'm looking this through the lens of a situation for me, but I mean, whether I became and there were other people that were asked to prayerfully consider being a deacon, and they said no.
Yeah.
I don't question why they said no by any means, but they said no. They may have gone out and said, can I build a tower? Can I go to war?
So
Doesn't make them any less of a follower of
Sure.
Christ. And they're doing as much, if not more than I am, and for the kingdom of God, they just might not be doing it in the role of deacon. I really, I don't know, sorry.
No, I like it. I'm silent because I think you're right. Some people are asked to partake of something, and they count the cost up and realize it's not something they can do. Is that a failure under God's direction? I think is the difficult thing we might have to deal with, versus those who say the cost is this, but because I've done the cost, I see it to the end, right? And the same warning can be said for those who say, I see the cost and then don't like the cost, some way between, which would be the war discussion, right? So therefore, any of you who does not renounce the same word, apostasete, all that he is cannot be my disciple, give up or say goodbye to, or walk away from. Okay, let's see if we can link, because the last bit of 14 is the salt. And I'm going to tell you all that I understood this, but I wasn't quite sure of why it's there. Salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. How's that linked back to the cost of discipleship? Does anybody have an idea? Clearly, salt's a big deal, right? Salt was a big deal in this time. It was expensive. It was payment, salary. The word sal comes from the Latin word sal. Salary comes from them paying in salt. And we know that being salt and light was a big deal in Jesus' ministry. He used that 4 or 5 times, this idea of salt, that you would flavour food, but it was also a preservative, etc., etc. And if it loses its saltiness, I've always struggled with that. How does salt lose its saltiness other than it dissolves in water? Unless it's the block. Unless it's the block, right?
Well,
It's not broken up.
I mean, I'm cheating. It's my commentary, but.
Say again?
I'm cheating because it's in my commentary.
That's
but
not cheating.
They were talking about how it was harvested. So if the salt came from the Dead Sea, if it was.
So the salt came from the Dead Sea, it's harvested.
If it was harvested and you brought up bad parts with the salt, then they would say it lost its saltiness. Not that it physically wasn't salty like we know it, but most salt came from the Dead Sea and contained impurities. If not processed properly, it would have a poor taste and be worse than useless. That does change it. Hold on, that does, yeah, okay. So you can't eat, it's not even good to put in the soil or put in the manure. Okay.
So,
It wasn't that it wasn't salty, it was that it tasted bad.
okay, so you're right, as you harvest it, and I'm sure actually there's a little bit of a applicable nature in that those who were harvesting would not waste stuff that they couldn't sell, so they would sell it to you of what was useless, right? Oh, maybe that's what he means by if he is to hear, let him hear. Once again, your foundational piece about sorry, I shouldn't be quiet. There's too much. What they call that? Bad radio, right? So let's look. I know that there's a simpleness to this, but even when we look at it, there's still a simpleness to it. So what I can see, I know that we've gone over a real key here. Jesus didn't say or do anything without intention. So the cost of discipleship is a clear intention that wasn't just for the people. He's saying it to a great crowd. Even by applicable nature today, we have great crowds in our church, but only a small few of us are called to ministry, to really be ministry, to the point you make about the deacons, okay? I completely understand that. Not everybody is called to be a minister, otherwise nothing would get done, right?
And he's saying if they're here for themselves, then you're worthless.
And if you're here for yourself,
Yeah, but if you're here for God.
Yeah, maybe
no, I think that's great. The harvesting is also the key too. Is that some harvesting of disciples is going to be, you cannot bring up the waste with your discipleship. Yes, you cannot bring up the waste with your discipleship, right? If you're going to be a salty disciple, a true salty disciple, then the stuff that's harvested with all the baggage and garbage must be left behind. Yeah?
Yeah.
We just did that together.
Yay.
Love it. No, seriously, that's it. That's it. That must be it. The harvesting of the salt is key to your understanding of the commitment that you make up front. That you come and you clean out first. There's a little bit of understanding to get a life, you give up a life, right? And that's the discipleship issue. And he also says to many people in his ministry that it's not for all of you. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden you're not invited to the banquet.
Right.
If you choose to say that you are invited to the banquet, right, as a disciple, then you'd better take a humble approach to that discipleship first.
Can we go back to the previous parable about the large banquet and go, maybe part of the anger from the master is that they responded with an affirmative to be at the banquet?
And then they didn't turn up.
And they didn't turn up.
Yes!
So we must think that there's those who are invited, but on the initial invitation said, sorry, I can't make based on your initial invitation. Or, well, we should only be thinking of those who said, I'm coming, and didn't come.
Well, not only that, he would have made the banquet on the numbers who were going to say they'd come, and they didn't turn up. As in, all the work, all the preparation, all the cooking, all the way the house looks, every cleaner that's gone through it, everything that he's done for that banquet table, and he did it based on whom he invited, and they did not show up.
Many are invited, but
Few will, right.
Yeah.
So you know something? It's already done. Everything's laid out. Go in the street and get anybody who's around and who's willing to come and eat with me, get them to come to my table now.
It's the willing part, though.
Yeah. It's the willing part, right? These two people are like, I came, but I've got something bigger on. I've got to do this, I've got to do that. I actually can't go because the law says I can't go because I've just married my wife and it says I've got to stay with my wife, right? And it's the excuses of the invite that's key. Now, I do think that's followers. I'm not just saying that that's disciples. I think there are those who are going to be invited who will put an excuse in front of the invite. Yeah? I'm not following Jesus Christ. There's no way I'm getting up on Sunday mornings to go and sit in church. I think they're all hypocrites. I think they're all self-righteous. I think they're not with the world. They come up with their own judgments. It's not the way of the times. And that's happening right now. And you know it is. You know people who feel that way. Who look down their nose at you because they think that you are a self-righteous, judgmental Christian. Which you may be. That's not my point. My point being is that that's the invite. I'm not coming. And they give a reason why they're not coming. And it can be materialistic and it can be legalistic. It doesn't have to be legalistic based on the law. It can be legalistic based on secularism of today. And Jesus will turn around to the other people and say, fine, you are welcome. Right? And I hadn't seen it. I like the link between those and then essentially the discipleship piece. That you think you're invited because you sit there as a legalistic Pharisee and you know the law and you can police the law and you can be the judge and jury on theological issues because you know the law, and at the end of the day you haven't made the right commitment because essentially you've brought up half of the Dead Sea floor with you. That means you have no salt. Right. And you're selling it to those who you're saying with your saltiness, and you haven't any salt, and you're not worthy of the manure pile, and if you want to really listen, then you better be hearing. If I had a mic, I'd drop it. I think that's awesome. That's absolutely one of the key pieces of pulling this together. Well done. That's just wonderful.
Next paper topic.
No, that's really good. That's really, really good. That was a nice way of putting that all together. Right, I should continue, but we're not going to, because the parable of the lost sheep, the parable of the lost coin, and the parable of the prodigal son are massive. I know you all know that. Okay, I know you know that. So we're not going to start now. We're going to finish early because next week we will do those three parables, because that's the big parable section. I love you all. Have a great service. Enjoy the service, and I'll see you next week.